The room was silent, save for the faint rustling of the wind outside, brushing against the glass panes of the large bay window. Inside, the air was heavy, as if thickened by unsaid words and unacknowledged feelings. He stood at the doorway, his frame silhouetted by the dim hallway light, his gaze fixed on her, though he tried not to make it obvious. It had been a year since his father married her, the woman who now sat by the fireplace, her face partially illuminated by the soft amber glow. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him. It was the way she carried herself, the way she seemed to exude a quiet strength even when the world around her seemed chaotic. She was a mystery, one he hadn't dared to solve. "You're home late," as she said without looking up, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made him feel as though she had been waiting for him. It wasn't accusatory, but there was a weight to her words that lingered in the space between them. "Yeah," he replied, stepping into the room. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, and his expression was unreadable. "Got caught up with some friends." She finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze that made his chest tighten. It wasn't just the way her dark lashes framed her piercing eyes, it was the way she looked at him, as if she could see through the layers of bravado he wore like armor. "Your father called." "He's stuck at the office." "Some late meetings," she said, her tone softer now, almost as if she were trying to reassure him. "I wasn't sure if you'd be back for dinner." He shrugged, moving to the far side of the room where the liquor cabinet stood. "I'm not hungry," he muttered, though his movements betrayed his nervous energy. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, his hands steady despite the turmoil brewing within him. "You shouldn't be drinking that," as she said, rising from her chair. Her voice held a gentle reprimand, but there was also a trace of amusement. "You're not exactly old enough." He smirked, raising the glass in a mock toast. "Old enough to know better, but still young enough not to care," he quipped, taking a small sip. The warmth of the alcohol did little to ease the tension in his shoulders. She crossed the room slowly, her bare feet making no sound against the plush carpet. She stopped a few feet away from him, her arms crossed over her chest. "You're going to give your father a heart attack if he finds out you've been raiding his stash," she teased, though there was a seriousness beneath her playful tone. "He won't know," he said, setting the glass down on the polished wood surface. "You won't tell him." Her brow arched slightly, and she tilted her head. "What makes you so sure?" He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. His gaze held hers, unflinching and intense. "Because you're not like that," he said simply. The air between them seemed to thicken, the silence stretching out like a taut string ready to snap. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she took a small step back, her composure faltering for just a moment. "You should get some sleep," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "It's late." "So should you," he countered, his tone softer but no less charged. Her lips parted slightly as if to argue, but she closed them again, her expression unreadable. With a small shake of her head, she turned and walked back toward the fireplace. He watched her go, his chest tight with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. This wasn't the first time they'd had a moment like this, and he doubted it would be the last. But what scared him most wasn't the tension or the unspoken words. It was the part of him that didn't want it to end. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm golden hues across the room. He sat at the kitchen counter, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. The night before lingered in his mind, every glance, every word replaying like a song he couldn't forget. She entered the kitchen quietly, her presence as commanding as ever. She wore a simple robe, her hair still slightly tousled from sleep. She paused when she saw him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were weighing her words carefully. "A morning," as she said, her voice still soft with sleep. She moved toward the coffee pot, pouring herself a cup before leaning against the counter opposite him. "A morning," he replied, his voice steady but quieter than usual. He watched as she took a sip of her coffee, her eyes momentarily closing as if savoring the warmth. The silence between them was not unusual, but today it felt heavier. He wanted to say something, anything, but the right words seemed just out of reach. She was the one who broke the silence first. About last night, as she began, her eyes meeting his over the rim of her mug. We should talk. His heart skipped a beat. He set his mug down, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Okay, he said, his voice carefully neutral. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her mug. She paused, searching for the right words. I think it's important that we're clear about boundaries. I don't want things to get complicated. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, though he tried not to let it show. Complicated, he repeated, his tone almost bitter. Right. I'm serious, she said, her voice firmer now. Your father, he trusts me, and he trusts you. I don't want to do anything that would betray that trust. He looked at her, his jaw tightening. And what about what we want? He asked, his voice low but charged with emotion. She froze, her eyes widening slightly. This isn't about what we want, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about what's right. He pushed back from the counter, standing up abruptly. Right, he said, his tone sharp. Of course. It's always about what's right. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving her standing there, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her mug. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she tried to steady herself. She knew he was hurt, but she also knew that letting things go any further would only lead to more pain. For both of them, days turned into weeks, and though they still saw each other every day, an invisible wall seemed to have risen between them. They spoke when necessary, their conversations polite but devoid of the warmth they once shared. Yet, despite their efforts to keep their distance, the tension between them never truly disappeared. One evening, as the house fell silent and the world outside was cloaked in darkness, he found himself standing outside her door. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he shouldn't be there, but something inside him refused to let go. Before he could second-guess himself, the door opened, and she stood there, her expression a mix of surprise and something he couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them like a chasm. I couldn't sleep, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Neither could I, she said softly. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting shadows on the walls. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. She sat beside him, the distance between them small but significant. This can't keep happening, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We can't keep pretending there's nothing here. Then let's stop pretending, he said, turning to face her. His eyes searched hers, desperate for something, a sign, a hint of what she was feeling. It's not that simple, she whispered, her voice breaking. There's too much at stake. I don't care, he said, his voice firm. I can't keep pretending like you don't mean anything to me. Because you do. You mean everything. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away, her hands trembling as she wiped them away. You don't know what you're saying, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know exactly what I'm saying, he said, his voice unwavering. And I think you feel the same way, even if you won't admit it. She turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anguish and longing. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped, and they were the only two people in existence. But then she stood up, putting distance between them once more. This has to stop, as she said firmly, though her voice wavered. It has to. He stood as well, his expression one of determination. You can't just turn this off, he said. Neither can I. Her resolve faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Good night," she said, her voice final. He hesitated for a moment, his heart aching, before finally nodding. "Good night," he said softly, leaving the room. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Deep down, he knew their story was far from over.